stuff. We're going to be doing an 8-part series. There's a list that's been published. There's copies of it there, and these are mostly modular. Tonight's session sort of sets the stage, and then there's several ways to go about this kind of work. I decided to do it, a lot of it, sort of by person. You know, next week is Martin Luther. And we're going to kind of carry on stories about Martin Luther, and then Zwingli and John Calvin, and then the English Reformation. So the history, if you're like looking at the calendar, it's going to zip through back and forth. But I'm sort of looking in place and person. And that's how I'll be approaching things. And then at the end, the last two sessions, one is about some stuff going on in England that led directly to Methodism, the Wesleyan movement, but also the Oxford movement, which most folks hadn't heard about. And then the last session is an attempt to really kind of examine this, what Phyllis Tickle, a writer who passed away recently, called it the 500-year rummage sale. You may have heard that. It seems that every 500 years in the eras, we go through some huge changes. There was this kind of from republic to empire around the time of Jesus. There's the fall of Rome. There's this split between East and West. In 1000, in 1500, there's this Reformation. And 500 years later, right? We're going through it now, these huge shifts. So we're going to talk about that. And that brings us up to today and what's going on. Today is about setting the stage, and so I'm going to be kind of grab bagging some things, but really it is framing out really what's going on, what's in the water, what's going on in the atmosphere there. I know that we have some choir folks that need to be out because you'll have choir practice at 7. I'm going to try to get done as much as I can so it's Q&A by then, but I'm going to be kind of flex with time. So that's my hope and plan. So if you need to go, you go, please. We understand you have good work ahead, and I want y'all good for Sunday. So 500 years ago, a monk in Germany made a list of 95 issues he wanted the theologians in the Roman Catholic Church to discuss. We have a picture here of there we go. Well, there we go. Martin Luther there and all that. Little did he know these 95 theses to talk about in an academic setting sparked a big old Reformation. And it became a movement that it would split the church, form a new kind of Christianity, the Protestant movement. This story, of course, begins a whole lot earlier. There were years of power struggles in the church, as well as between religious and civil leaders that had weakened the reputation of the clergy. Early 16th century, by the time we got to the 16th century, popes sold government and church positions, made their illegitimate children cardinals, authorized murder, increased families' fortunes, abused power. The Renaissance was happening at the same time, brought education, wealth, and revitalization to the people. If you've been to museums and see all that fancy art, if you see art that fancy, that means people have free time and money. And there's if you have free time, that means there's a certain level of people have nice stuff. And if people have nice stuff, they start wanting to hold on to that nice stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Because in the midst of all that going on, there's greed, abuse of power, immorality within the church. And all these factors brought the need for Reformation to a boiling point. Now, the subjects we're going to be covering is more than just interesting history. They provide they impacted the whole formation of Western civilization. And their influence is really still with us. There are themes that we're going to be rolling through over the next 8 weeks that are impacting Christians today. We, like Wycliffe, must deal with God as ultimate authority. What does that mean for us? Like Luther, where does grace and versus works. How does that all balance out? Zwingli and Calvin, what is God's providence and what is free will, and how do you balance that? Like the Anabaptist movement, we struggle to the present day about how do you do church and state. We're still dealing with that one, aren't we? With Tyndale, where should the Bible fit? And how do we teach the Bible? In the deepest sense, this series is not just a pilgrimage into the historical past. It's also one to see how we got to where we are today and what do we do with all the stuff lying around, the ideas we have lying around. Now, here's what I want to say. The Catholic leaders and direction the church has taken by the end of the medieval era are not good. This study, though, is not designed to be anti-Catholic. Remember, except for, there's exceptions. There's the Eastern Orthodox or the Ethiopian Coptic Church. But for the Western world, the only church was the Catholic Church. It was just the church. And so this study is not to be anti-Catholic. It's just saying the church got to a difficult spot by the time we're getting to the 14, 1500s, a really difficult spot. And we know that no matter what denomination we belong to or know, there are going to be people who are political opportunists, and some people are going to be mean-spirited, and there's going to be doctrinal deficiencies that require a little more work. No matter which denomination you look at, that's going to exist. As I've said many times, I have a strong belief in original sin, right? And original sin just keeps on popping its head up. So it's just, and even the most reputable Catholic historians will readily acknowledge the Catholic Church was in desperate need of reform. And actually, the Roman Catholic Church at the Council of Trent in the mid-1500s did a huge amount of reforms. And there's so much connecting that to the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. Some of you may have been around for that one to remember. When moving from Latin Mass to vernacular language and stuff like that. I've got a newspaper my mom saved, and it was when JFK was shot. And there's a big thing about JFK being shot, and then there's a whole section on the side because Vatican II is going on, and they made several decisions that were published in the paper. So, there it is side by side. There's stuff in Council of Trent that connects directly to what was going on in the 1960s. It's pretty amazing. Without exception, all the reformers treated in this series were children of the Roman Catholic Church, probably first. There's in the first 6 sessions for sure. At one point in time, they were all Catholic. And their initial love for God and their commitment to Christ was formed in that communion and then developed in different ways. And some of them, you'll hear, are pretty positive. Some of them are kind of negative, and we'll talk about that too, because there's some pretty tough stuff in this history. And there continues to be talks between Protestants and Catholics. The Catholic Church and the Lutheran Church continue to be in talks about the meaning of justification by faith, and they actually came out with a series of things in the past few decades of, actually we agree on a lot of things. Pretty interesting. The name Protestant was first used by the Lutherans in 1529 when they formally protested a decree of the Emperor Charles V. And then that name, they're Protestants. It became expanded to the followers of Calvin and all these other things just kind of popping up all through Europe. In many ways, the Reformation broke with traditions that had been built up during the Middle Ages. In fact, we're going to be looking at John Wycliffe in just a second. And that is still in the Middle Ages. He's around in the 1300s, 200 years before Luther nailed anything on the wall. But stuff's already starting to crop up 200 years before. So let's kind of go backwards though. We have the early middle. I thought I had another slide. Oh yeah, here we go. I got my slides out of order already. The early Middle Ages. So, what's going on first in the theology? We're going to get into some of the practical stuff that was going on, but theology-wise, the Middle Ages were about scholasticism, and they were deeply impacted by Greek forms of argument. And I've got here the Summa Theologica, the Sum of Theology from Thomas Aquinas. This is a Latin version. I have not been able to read Latin in over 25 years. And I will not do so tonight. But if you look through that, what you'll see is there is a question posed, and then sub-questions. And then it says, okay, we take our question, and then here's the pros, here's the cons, here's my conclusion. It's all very organized. Every question. This is the era that folks laughing about it, and joking about it in that time said they're arguing over how many angels God can dance on the head of a pin. It was getting, they were so focused on every little bit of theology, they kind of forgot the point of the theology. Does that make sense? You can get so argumentative over the tiniest little point. In other words, how many angels can dance at the head of a pin? I remember one question we had to kind of study is, are demons allowed to baptize? And there's whole arguments over that. And the question that I've always came up with, I've heard, I was like, so that comes up often? Right? So, there's this whole Aristotelian logic method. And you see here it said Aristotelian logic. In other words, they're borrowing from way back. They're leapfrogging way back into pre-Roman era and grabbing those philosophical tools and trying to apply them to the Christian faith. And meanwhile, while that's going on in the kind of the scholastic, monastic era, this whole theology argument, meanwhile, the church itself is made up with those in power and a lot of folk religion. And you had monastics, you had mystics, you had visionaries, you had reform movements such as the Franciscans, St. Francis, preaching to the birds. You had folks doing, interesting stuff like that. You had a lot of folk religion that mixed kind of late pagan stuff and Christian stuff in local areas. And they kind of swirled around together. And so local folk tales, the hero in it might go from a local hero into a saint. That was kind of happening. You had a whole disconnect because you had priests doing everything in Latin and people less and less were speaking Latin. Most of the services were the priests turning their back to the group doing their thing. There were no such thing as pews or seats. People kind of came and went, and everyone's here just kind of doing their stuff. The priests are. That's going on kind of in the church. Meanwhile, in the government stuff, the Magna Carta is signed in 1215. The English barons had King John agree to certain rights, such as trial by a jury of peers. Parliament called in 1295, a first form of government that doesn't just involve a king just saying, well, because I said so. So government is starting to shift as the High Middle Ages come up. Then you get, it gets to the point when in Pope Boniface the eighth, I'm trying to remember the year. Oh, I don't remember that. I can't remember. 1338? No, doesn't matter. Anyway, I don't remember a date, and I'm bad with dates. So said, we need to get real clear about some stuff. All this government systems and kings coalescing, just to be really clear, the Pope's in charge. Oddly enough, it was the Pope who said the Pope's in charge. Right? The head of Christ, his representative is the Roman Pope. There's two forms of power. There's two swords. One, the spiritual and the temporal. The spiritual power is borne by the church. The temporal power is borne for the church under the direction of the clergy by the state. Notice who's in charge. The church, right? And the spiritual authority of the Pope is supposed to be above the temporal and all that. You know, the only reason a Pope has to write all this stuff is he noticed his power was slipping away. You don't have to say, no, I'm in charge, if everyone already knows you're in charge. If he's writing that, that meant he was having a lot of folks pushing against authority. In 1336, the electors of the Holy Roman Empire decided they can elect the emperor without interference of the Pope. That's 1338. Already some proto-democratic stuff has happened. I don't want to go and call it democracy. These electors were not exactly of and by the people, right? But that's happening. Again, this is just a lot of stuff swirling in the water because this Reformation didn't pop up out of nowhere. There's stuff happening in the civic world. There's stuff happening in the religious world. All this stuff is starting to happen. And as the 15th century, the 1400s, come to a close, it's clear the church is in need of desperate reform. Because here's what had happened. 1309 to 1377, the Avignon papacy, it was called, the Pope was not in Rome, the Pope was in France. Because all the French cardinals said, we'll elect our own. And they elected the Pope. Uh-oh. And then they said, well, France ain't going to control the papacy. We're going to control. And they ended up with 3 popes simultaneously, each declaring they're the real Pope. Aren't you glad we don't have stuff like this happening in our government where people keep on claiming, elections are bad, right? So that's called the Great Schism, when you actually had 3 popes at the same time. As a result, there was war, intrigue, bribery, all this stuff. They wanted to outdo ancient Rome with all this gaudiness of the Renaissance. Let's paint some cool stuff. I haven't gotten to go through Europe. I've just been through England. They destroyed most of it. But you've been on those tours through Europe. You know what I'm talking about. Wow, that's some pretty nice stuff you got here. A lot of money flowing. As a result, a lot of people believed in the authority of the Roman Pope, but it really found it difficult to reconcile their belief with the actual occupants in the office, sometimes, again, plural. There became what was the conciliar movement. In other words, well, this single guy in charge, it's kind of iffy. It's not seeming to be working out. Let's have councils. So let's have the conciliar movement. And that's how they sought to end that great schism, get the morals of the entire church going in one way. And by the way, that the great schism there, each of the colors is a different person listening to a different pope. So you had the red one, that's allegiance to Avignon. The Roman was the yellow there. Eastern Orthodox is over there. And then you had, there's the one in, I think was it Nice? Anyway, you kind of get the idea. I mean, it's just kind of all over the place. And of course, also, while all this is going on, Islam is growing. And there's huge chunks that are actually Islamic controlled. It's almost the empire we forget. Anyway, so all that's happening. Meanwhile, I think where I am here. Yeah, okay. There we go. Okay. So all that's happening in the government and the papacy. Meanwhile, a lot of the social structures and values built up after the Roman Empire were deteriorating. So the Roman Empire fell, and everyone's kind of left to their own, but they had all the stuff lying around, right? And then more and more people didn't know how to use it. Aqueducts, the nice saunas and baths they had. After a while, that stuff broke. And people's world got smaller and smaller and smaller, down to we're vassals of this one local lord, The government started building back up again. People became, we had these set folks in charge of like nationalism, and we'll kind of talk about that in a second some more. And as soon as things kind of got reorganized, then you'd have like a plague or something. So the Black Death, bubonic plague, 2/5 of the population died. Think of what that does to an economy. 2/5 die. Well, I'll tell you one thing it does. It means there's a lot of extra farmland up for grabs. Right? Now, 2/5 of the population dies. Well, that's some nice stuff my neighbors had. They're dead now. That's some really nice stuff that I now have. Right? And if you had the arms, you had the weapons, you could just kind of take stuff over. There was a 100 Years' War between England and France that spanned the 14th and 15th centuries. Introduced some modern warfare stuff like gunpowder. There was a discovery of a little thing called the New World. You add in, after this demographic crisis, again, new monarchies. You had Louis XI in France, Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain, Henry Tudor in England, bringing these governments under one leader. It's one thing when the Pope had to deal with a lot of local lords, but now he has to deal with huge nation states. That's a different critter altogether. And Western thought was continuing to develop, astronomy and all that. All this is happening. Why do we think the church could just stay the same? When everything in culture is completely shifted, it's of course going to impact the church. Meanwhile, the church itself, again, was having a lot of problems. You would buy and sell ecclesiastical positions. You have extra kids. The firstborn gets your nice property. What am I going to do with my second, third, and fourth? Well, my secondborn, he could probably be a bishop. I'll buy one of those. Yes, he is 10 years old, but that's okay. He'll be a great bishop. That's how you did it. Clerical celibacy was the law of the church, but bishops and local priests alike flaunted it. Monasteries became centers of leisurely living, and that's why you kept on having new monastic orders pop up. You have one, you say, oh, we're going to be rigorous. Oh, and they're very rigorous and holy. Oh, wow, let's pay them, and they'll pray for us and all that. They get really rich. Yeah, we're not going to go do the farmland. We're going to buy things to happen. Oh, and they became very luxury living in these monasteries. And then a new monastic order would crop up. So that's kind of a cycle happening. So here we were, some big questions. How could one practice asceticism in a monastery that is rich? How could a priest resist corruption in a parish when he had probably purchased the position? How could the laity trust a sacrament of penance, saying, okay, you said confession, you're gonna get heaven from a priest, a clergy who seems to have no morality? That's really getting to the point of how is this whole thing going to stay together? Well, meanwhile, John Wycliffe, the age of reform, the Morning Star is his nickname. He lived during that Avignon papacy, and he was in Oxford. I was a student at Wycliffe Hall when I was in England. And he, 1330, 1384, he left the university, served the crown, diplomat, kind of back and forth. The scandal of the Great Schism with the three popes really, really made him mad. He began saying that the true church of Jesus Christ is not the pope or the hierarchy, but rather the invisible body of those predestined to salvation. He went back to Augustine of Hippo. You can imagine how well that was well liked amongst the people in power, saying the true church is not you in power, it's this greater body. And according to Wycliffe, he said that Scripture is owned by the church, not just the clergy, and so that it needs to be translated by people. And by 1408, after he died, his followers started translating the Bible into English. Ruh-roh. Until then, the main version was all Latin. It was called the Latin Vulgate. It was created by Jerome, right there during Roman Empire era at the end of that. So we've had this Latin Bible. Now it's in English, his followers. That really made people mind. It became illegal to translate or read the Bible in English without permission of a bishop. Can you imagine? Illegal. And then he also got into some controversy over the presence of Christ in Holy Communion. Now that'll get you killed, right? We're about to have World Communion Sunday. We're all, we believe different things. We're all going to be around the table. Yeah, that was not a big thought in the in the medieval period. And so he was kind of not into the transubstantiation thing. He still died in the communion of the church, but the church was so mad at him. Look what they did. Posthumously condemned him in 415. In 1428, they disinterred his body, his bones, burned it to ash, and threw it into the river Swift. Now, that'll teach you. I mean, can you imagine? We hate you so much, we're going to unbury your body, burn it, and throw it in the river. Golly. So, but that there you go. That's what happens when you turn the Bible into English, right? But his followers kept on doing that, and they did a full version of the Bible. They called it the Wycliffe Bible. His followers are called the Lollards. You've heard that term, the Lollards. It's a pejorative term. It's a word meaning mumblers. Yes, sir.
Do we have any idea how many people could read and write at that time?
Oh, that's a good question. Not a lot. Now, in English, there'll be slightly more, but here's the thing. The English version that we're talking about here does not resemble today's English. This is 1300s English, so even someone in like Shakespeare's time would not be able to read it. It's like an older English version. I think Beowulf is an earlier version, but it's kind of in between our English and Beowulf, their English. But yeah, I think the main thing is, and of course it's not being printed yet. We haven't gotten to Gutenberg yet. It's written, but it'd be written so that people who could read it out loud. Does that make sense? In the monasteries even, the Bibles were very rare. In fact, a parish church may not even have a Bible on premises. If they did have one, it'd be one of those big ones they would keep under lock and key and bring it out and read the Latin, and no one would understand it. The idea behind this is, here's an English version you could read out loud, and the group could hear it from the one person who could read it. And reading silently to yourself is a very modern invention, by the way. Most people, when they read verbally until very recently. I'm trying to remember when that kind of switched over. That's a very modern thing, to read silently to yourself. So, not sure about those numbers, but that's a great question. But think of it as a verbalized Bible, a guide to do the verbal Bible. So they had the Lollards, they were doing their thing. And by the time you got to the 1500s, you knew something has to be done. That conciliarism, let's have another council. Let's fix it all. And that was the Fifth Lateran Council, 1512, 1517. It was held in Lyons, France. The idea was, and that's just kind of there in the middle there, okay, we're gonna get this handled. We know we have problems. Let's fix the problems. Let's do church reform, all that. They failed miserably. Everyone got together. They said, yeah, church reform. Yeah, let's not do that. And instead, they voted to advocate for the power and dignity of bishops. Shocking, right? And they declared war with the Turks. Because, of course, isn't that the most human story? Hey, we really need to get together and solve this and fix this. And we got together and we said, you know what? The real problem is people aren't listening to us. So let's make sure everyone listens to us. And by the way, you know who really caused all these troubles? It's those Turks. So let's go fight the Turks. So that's what they did. They declared war. All these bishops got together. They gave thanks to themselves, nice stuff, and then told, oh, yeah, go fight those people. Don't worry about the church, nothing to see here. 7 months after the last meeting was held is when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses on the wall. 7 months. In other words, they had a chance. And they failed. So, contextual factors. First thing is the humanist. So, the Renaissance is happening. And usually when you think about Renaissance, what do you think of? What? New? Art? Nice art, nice architecture, right? Nice stuff. Change. Yeah. Okay. So, the Renaissance itself, if you noticed on the art and talking about change, in so many ways, the Renaissance is about not leapfrogging forward, it's imagining the backwards looking really nice. So in other words, they'll say, oh, if you look at Renaissance art, so much of it will be art that is versions of, like more perfected versions of Roman and Greek stories of gods. You'll see all mythology taken and pulled out of that Roman era or the Greek era and replanted in this Renaissance era. And so you'll see, if you look at a lot of Renaissance art, it is Aphrodite. It's going to be Zeus. And God, the image of God looks a lot like Zeus. Right? So the Renaissance is going back and yanking all that stuff past the whole Dark Ages into the modern. And it's going back to the sources. But it's taking the sources and reworking them. And at the time, they had what was called the humanist. Now, we hear humanist, and our ears are attuned to say, oh, like a secular humanist. Now, think of this. The humanist basically refers to the people who study the humanities. So, when we talk about humanist here in this moment, it's not, the human nature above all others. It's looking at the literary and artistic glories of antiquity and perfected versions of that. Because they thought, look, we spent the last, 1,200 years stuck in yucky art and bad art. They knew how to really do nice stuff back then. And so we're going to grab that and drop it back into our time. We do that too, right? What does the front of our church look like with the columns? Yeah, Greek revival. And so while all that's happening in art, the same thing is going on with stuff that is written. Gutenberg has a printing press, right? They start movable type. I'll talk about that a little more in a second. But they're able to go back now and start printing stuff that has not been in print, which is people writing it down, in centuries upon centuries. They're going back to original sources and sharing the information. Like there may be one copy of something from Plato stuck in one library in one little corner of Italy. But now they can take that and make copies of it in an easy way. Multiple copies. not a painstaking one letter at a time in a monastery way. And so people are not just going back in the art and looking back and bringing that up and revolutionizing the moment by this grab bag of antiquity. Now they're also going and looking at all the stuff written down. I showed you Thomas Aquinas. They were looking at stuff like him too. Here's the thing. In the medieval era, Thomas Aquinas would write something. It was pretty good stuff. But you didn't just have your local copy of Thomas Aquinas sitting around. So people would do their interpretation or cliff notes. And then people would do the cliff notes of their cliff notes. And by the time you got to the fifth version of the cliff notes of Thomas Aquinas, the way they answered the questions would be the exact opposite as Thomas Aquinas said. And they said, that's what Aquinas said. Well, now you could actually take it and print the original. Think of what that did to everybody. And add that into everything they could get their hands on to reprint, including the Bible. People hadn't been reading much of the Bible. What happens when you take manuscripts that are already kind of old and piece together from all over the known world and start shoving them together and saying, okay, well, what if we can do a better, clearer version of the actual Greek translation of the New Testament? Go back to the Greek. Remember, we've been working on a Latin version for this long. What happens if we go to the Greek? Erasmus is the one who started doing that. Erasmus of Rotterdam was the prince of the humanists. He believed that doctrines are significant. He held to Orthodox Christian theology on the incarnation, the Trinity. He said that however, that righteousness, in other words, being good in Christ, is more important than getting all your theology right. And he was impacted by Platonism and stuff like that. He did a lot of original research. Erasmus there was an interesting cat in the middle of the Reformation because he's starting to write all this stuff. You see when he dies, everybody was using him. The Catholics were using him, the later on the Lutherans. Everybody wanted to get Erasmus on their side because he was thought of as the one person who had read everything. He had the Greek New Testament, which was considered now the best version. You know, we have fights over KJV and all that. His version was considered the best at the time. It actually was not, but he thought it was, and everyone else did too. And so everyone was trying and vying to get him to say, stamp of approval of Erasmus. And here's the other thing. Unlike so many of the other folks, he was a follower of Jesus who believed in inner devotion and he had a statement. He said at baptism, you know, baptism is more than getting just sprinkled and then forgetting about it. He said, no, baptism means the beginning of a new life in Jesus Christ. What good is it to be outwardly sprinkled with holy water if one is filthy within? Uh-oh. Right? So that's Erasmus. So that's sort of the situation we're landing in, the ground of what we have. So let's look again. All the factors. You had a divided religious conscience in Europe. The trust in the church was rock bottom. It had been the spiritual mother for generations, but its failures were obvious to everybody. At a moral level, everybody knew it needed reformed. And then also they looked at theology, and they said, we cannot proceed on a theology where we're worrying about how many angels dance on the head of a pin. What is a theology that is really about the real stuff? And let's actually go back to the Bible. Funny thought that, right? Let's actually, now that we can print them, let's go to the Bible. So theology and morals were in shift. Renaissance language skills. People were learning other languages. You had the fall of Constantinople, and it flooded the whole Western Europe with scholars who could read Greek, which was like, oh. And they brought manuscripts with them no one had ever seen, like versions of the Bible that no one had ever seen. And they could now compare the Greek with the Latin. And people were saying, uh-oh, we made some translation mistakes several hundred years ago when Jerome looked at it. Okay. So they alerted to all this stuff because you keep on copying by hand over hundreds of years, you're going to have some mistakes. So now they had some earlier versions they brought with them west when the Constantinople fell. So they could actually go to the source. And then everyone remembered, oh yeah, remember that Wycliffe guy? Oh yeah, you mean the one we burned? And yeah, he had some stuff to say about this, didn't he? And then there was another guy called Huss who was doing the same thing in Bohemia. And then there was desire for this radical Reformation and this discontent amongst the masses. They looked around and said, people are just being bribed. They're stealing from us. There was a new marketplace economy, and with new money, it wasn't just like inherited wealth. And these new merchants were like, we're not going to pay for all this. We want to do other things with our money. And added to that, economic conditions of the masses. You take the Black Death and all that 100 Years' War, all that sort of stuff. I mean, all that had changed. The whole economy. There started to be peasant revolts. Pitchforks, literally. There were people with apocalyptic visions saying we need a new system for everything. The social fabric of local communities started getting torn apart. There was these money-rich merchants. They did not fit into the normal scheme of things. Their new money. We have nation states. As I said earlier, the nation states. France, England, Spain developed powerful monarchies that said, "Well, Pope, I know you think you're big stuff, but we're the ones with the actual army, and maybe we don't want to listen to you." And they were more and more independent from papal power. And then you had some other areas that had more of a nationalist view of things. Like they thought themselves, it used to be we're Christendom. Now they're like, we're German. We're French. They started thinking of themselves a little differently. Let's see. The rise of vernacular languages. We're speaking French. We're not just speaking. Everyone's doing not just Latin. Let me see what I can. Yeah, the 15th and 16th century, the formative period for most literary languages throughout Europe. Worldview. They discovered a new world, America. Think of what happens when you have now this whole new place. And they can start to travel also to the Far East. And they're learning stuff there too. Technology and science. Well, 1436, Johannes Gutenberg started on the printing press. The movable type printing press really made the debut. And Gutenberg was a goldsmith. He used his idea of how to work on metals. He was able to produce high-quality books with a durable typeface and make them up really fast. And it started in Germany and then spread out. And imagine, I was looking at this, a handmade Bible beforehand could cost a year's worth of wages. A handwritten Bible, a year's worth of wages. Now it could be just printed. Think of the difference when now you have Bibles flooding the zone that people could open. And now they're learning how to read, with more scholastic folks. The question then was, what happens if you put this thing in your vernacular? And we'll get to that with Martin Luther and the German Bible. So, all that's happening, obviously the church is going to get involved. Obviously it's going to impact. And as the Middle Ages is drawing to a close, all these things are happening simultaneously. And they thought of the church as obscuring the truth of Jesus Christ. We're learning all this new stuff. Why do you, corrupt leaders, think you have the power over Jesus and knowing and following Jesus? You've been teaching us all this stuff over the years. They said, what happens if we actually start believing it, right? And with all these pressures, it was like putting everything in a pressure cooker. And then when it pops, it really pops. And that's going to be what we're going to talk about next week with Martin Luther. And what you'll find in Martin Luther, I'm going to give you a little sneak peek before the crew leaves. What happens with Martin Luther is, Martin Luther, a monk there in Germany, an academic teaching at the university, thought, well, we need to have some conversations over some stuff. Let's put some theses on the wall, and that's a conversation here for the university, like a university lecture series. Here's the difference. A printing press meant his 95 statements about here's stuff we need to talk about could become mass-produced and transported all over Europe. In the days of Wycliffe, in the 1300s, everything had to be handwritten. It didn't get that far. It took a long time for it to be transported. This situation, it's the equivalent of the internet. Putting it on the bulletin board, hitting send on Facebook, post it. And everyone could find out the equivalent of immediately. It's a different world. Even Luther didn't know what he just did. And that's what we're going to be talking about next week.